Good morning, everybody. I see that somebody has raised their hand. If you have a question or comment for us, send it in the Q&A box. If you were just, playing with Zoom, that's cool too. Hey, Glenda, as we're sitting waiting for people to sign on, we've got a question that's best for you. Will the new lease be ready in Click and Lease anytime prior to the 14th of February?
Sure. So the lease itself will not be available for use prior to the 14th of February, but the fields for Lease 2.0 are already available. So if anybody is interested in working on that integration or setting up their default lease, those fields are available now.
Awesome. Thank you. I figured we may as well knock some questions out instead of sitting here in silence.
Yeah, and if anybody has more questions about that, they can email me at glenda@taa.org or reach out to Blue Moon as well.
All right, Chris, I show it's 10 o'clock. You ready?
Yes. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for TAA's third webinar regarding Lease 2.0. Today, we're going to be looking at community policies and sharing some information on this new aspect of TAA's lease. We're fortunate to have some really great attorneys to walk us through this process. Jennifer Owen with the Dallas law firm of Hiker Allen, David Fritchie, law office of David Fritchie in San Antonio. David also serves as general counsel to the San Antonio Apartment Association, and our own Sandy Hoy, TAA's general counsel. I think we're also being assisted by Corey Rogers this morning with the Rogers law firm here in Austin. So thanks to all of our panelists, and thanks to all of y'all for tuning in this morning. And with that, let me hand it over to Sandy.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, everyone. Good morning and Happy New Year. It's 2022 and we're still zooming around. It's a good way to get the information out. And like Chris said, this is our third part of a series of pre-release member education, and we wouldn't be able to do this without technology like this. So let's dive in and get started. The first thing, I'm sorry, I'm driving the train for the first time here, so let me make sure that there we go. Okay, let's dive right in. The disclaimer. Remember that this information we're giving to you today is general in nature. It's not intended to be legal advice, and we're not intending to create any kind of industry standards. We're also not trying to replace the advice of your own counsel, and you might hear this a couple times today, but in crafting your lease packet and thinking through how you're going to transition to the new lease form and related addenda, it's very important that you look at it from a holistic perspective and make sure that it matches with your own operations in your own specific facts and how you deal with your property management. you'll hear that a few different times, but we wanted to make sure that you do consult your attorney if you have any specific questions. We're not here to provide you legal advice, but we are here to help you answer any questions and guide you through this transition process. So we're trying to answer as many questions as we can through the webinars like this and through the chat function, but feel free to reach out to us. Any of our team members, Glenda and I often receive a lot of questions, and those form some of the FAQ documents and other educational programs that we put on. So if you are thinking it and wondering it, then probably somebody else is, and we are happy to take your questions. Like Chris said, we have two rock star attorneys with us today, Jennifer and David. But if they say anything really wild, that's their own opinion, and that's not speaking directly from TAA. Had to bring that in. Next, a couple reminders about timing. We are coming up to February. We've been working hard at this new Lease 2.0 for about a year and a half now. So we're very excited to be approaching the release date here in a couple of weeks on February 16th. Up until that date, up until that time period, we have extended the expiration dates on the current or old lease form. And so those are still good up until that new lease form is being put in the system. There are not going to be two leases at one time in the system. So once the new lease 2.0 is in the system, you will no longer have access to the old, to the current lease form. A note about printed forms. We are in the process of not only releasing the Lease 2.0 in the Click and Lease system on February 16th, but all of the related addenda are going to be updated and will be released on that date as well, because they relate to the new lease form. So if you use printed lease forms, then you're going to want to make sure that your related addenda are the newest and the latest and greatest and have all the revisions in there and match the new lease form that you're using. Okay, so we had board approval of the new lease back in October, and since then we've really focused on different resources and putting together resources that you can access online and that are linked here. We have a one-pager that has been floating around. It's really just that high-level overview of pinpointing the biggest changes in the lease document. We have an FAQ, frequently asked questions document that is linked here, and it may be updated after this webinar depending on the type of questions that we get. So make sure, again, you're regularly checking back. And then, depending on your learning style, we have the two apartment and the residential lease sample here linked, and as well as the community policies addendum that we will be walking through today. So I'm a hard copy person. So what I like to do, especially if there's like a new project in place, is print it out, and we're literally highlighting and spotlighting different provisions that you might, keep referring to throughout the year, or especially as you are working with it, if you're a hands-on on-site person, that you might want to just have a working copy with you. And so we have those linked for you right here. We're also working on like an understanding the lease article that will be coming soon to you, and we'll be putting that on Redbook Online, and it'll probably be around the release date as well. So keep an eye out for that. Okay, so as we said, we've had this is the third part of our pre-release member education. That extended release date for the lease has really allowed us to focus on education and making sure members are comfortable with the new lease document before it is being used. So the first part, they're all linked online as well. If you have any questions about it, let us know. But the first one was just really an executive summary that hit kind of the highlights, our favorite changes and our favorite things that we kept the same in the lease document. The second one was really a closer look to the first page of the lease details box, and the mechanics of filling that out. And then today, we're really going to be focusing on community policies and how the community policies addendum works with the new lease document, and how the references in the lease and walking through those provisions, which is a big change. But we're also going to be pinpointing some of the things that have absolutely remained the same. We will be on the lookout for other, educational opportunities here, of course, post release. And we're also holding a JP webinar exclusively just for JPs on February 10th. And then we're working on the Red Book seminars, of course, that will, spend a significant amount of time on Lease 2.0. So if you don't have your spot in one of those Red Book seminars, make sure you sign up, because those dates and times are filling up. And then, of course, the Red Book, the actual Red Book will be available in March from your local association. All right, before we walk through the document, the lease document and the community policies addendum that we've put together, we've gotten some FAQs that I want to just start out at the beginning, and we're going to hit on some of these throughout the program today. So the first question is, okay, well, do we have to have community policies? What if we don't have community policies? What if we have our own? We're getting a lot of questions like that. You don't have to have community policies. You can run your rental property just with the lease form itself, and it's not legally required to have a community policies document that is part of your lease packet. However, we have emphasized and elevated community policies as part of our Lease 2.0 rewrite. This was based in large part off of a ton of feedback that we got, both from operational people and technological experts, relating to how the lease form is viewed, both from a resident perspective and from a management perspective. So you don't have to have community policies, but our strong recommendation is to have community policies, and is to really think through what kind of rules that you would want to expand on any lease provisions that are in the lease, or that are perhaps outside of the lease document. Can we change the TAA community policies addendum? Yes, you can change the TAA community policies addendum. There is a difference between a copyrighted lease form and a sample management form. TAA hosts a ton of forms in our program that are sample management forms, and we encourage you to take the forms and customize them to meet your practices and your needs. You don't have to. You can use the forms as is, but there is that distinction between a copywritten lease form and a sample management form that you can download, edit, customize as needed. And so there will be different examples that you'll see in our community policies addendum, where you can absolutely go in and customize and change it to meet your exact needs. Again, the guidance would be, make sure that you get upper management to review and an attorney to review any of those changes that you do make prior to using those forms and implementing them into your lease packet. Okay, so what are community policies? Again, they expand on lease provisions, and they can be tailored again to your specific property or your company. A lot of members are wanting, the one size fits all standard provision, but as we know, not all of those provisions will fit each specific property or each specific fact. And so you're going to want to look at it from a from a holistic perspective and make sure that that lease packet that you are getting printed out or getting signed by residents really contemplates the things that are going on in that property and in that management practice. The TAA Community Policies Addendum covers certain topics that we decided at the rewrite and the review process of the lease is that they really don't need to be in the lease document. They're not required to be in the 6-page lease contract to form the contractual relationship. They are good things to have. They are good things to think about. They you might really rely on the security deposit deductions paragraph, for instance. But again, through our member feedback, we saw that a lot of members do these types of things very differently. Method of payment, parking, resident requests, amenities and packages. Those types of things, it's not a one-size-fits-all management practice. There's many different sectors and ways members go about doing these things. And so what we did is not put everybody in a box and say, you're prescribed, you have to do it this way. Instead, we moved it to a community policies addendum, and which allows you to think about and say, that does not apply to me. I don't need that paragraph, or that paragraph is great, but let's remove the check boxes and just make them 1, 2, and 3 for my own technology part of things. Those kinds of considerations should absolutely be happening, and conversations should absolutely be happening right now, leading up into the release date. So again, that's just a short list of the items that we'll be talking about and that are listed in the community policies addendum that we have put together. Okay, so now let's move to the actual lease document, and the difference between the old lease and the new lease is that we have defined some terms. You'll see community policies capitalized in the lease. There are several different references. Jennifer and David are going to go through each of them, and they have capital community policies, capital C, capital P. That refers to this provision, to this definition in the lease. And what are community policies? Well, they're in 1.5 right there, and it says that they are written community rules and policies, including the property signage, with which you and your occupants and your guests must comply. So they are incorporated into the lease through this definition and referenced throughout the lease. And so that's why we do encourage you to have a community policies addendum. If you don't, pick up the TAA's form and incorporate any other ones that are into that. Okay, the next paragraph that I want to highlight is paragraph 10. Paragraph 10 is very similar to the old paragraph 19, where we talked about community policies and rules. Here, paragraph 10 says community policies become part of the lease and they must be followed. This is where you can make changes. It says we can make changes, including additions to our written community policies, and those changes become effective immediately if those policies are distributed and applicable to all units and do not change the dollar amounts in the lease details. This is very similar, exactly the same way that it operated under the current lease form through paragraph 19. Now you see it in paragraph 10, it uses community policies, and that definition, it's all incorporated into the lease. And this is the way you are able to modify and change the lease mid-lease term, as long as it's reasonable and you don't change the dollar amounts in the lease. 10.3, just a note, it says if you violate the community policies, you're violating the lease. That's another concept that we've woven throughout. Finally, I would like to pinpoint paragraph 32. 32 is at the very end of the lease, and it says that the following special provisions or attached special provisions in any addenda or community policies provided are part of the lease and supersede any conflicting provisions in the lease. So if you don't like one particular provision in the TAA lease form, this is the way to change it, and any change would supersede any conflicting provision in the lease. Again, very similar to how it worked in the past under the old current lease form, and that same we were consistent in that approach with the lease 2.0. So with that, I think that's my last slide. Yes, I will turn it now over to Jennifer to do the next chunk of slides.
Thank you, Sandy. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you today. So the word for 2022 is opportunity, right? This is the chance to learn a new lease. We're going to learn it together. It has lots of great features and benefits. We're going to audit our current documents and practices and see where they need to be updated and customized to match what we do. So the community policies document itself, this is the first paragraph, pretty straightforward. We're just matching this document to the lease that it is tied to, that it is amending. And so you just want to make sure that all the information you put here matches the information on page 1 of the lease. And we'll go to the next slide. So this is a somewhat significant difference, right? The payment methods previously were in the lease itself, and now they're in the community policies. This is great. You get to customize and specify the particular payment methods that you use. So in the highlighted language, the payment instructions are directly incorporating the community policies. It tells the resident, you pay how we specify in our community policies. So if you didn't have any community policies, then you wouldn't be expanding this definition. And that would mean essentially the residents could pay in any manner and any place they wanted, but they just couldn't pay with cash. So this is a good illustration of why it's important to have community policies and to tailor them to your specific practices. Next slide. So we're kind of, as we go through this presentation, we're showing you what the Lease 2.0 says and what the matching section of the community policies says. So here we see in paragraph 2 of the community policies, this is your place to illustrate and specify what your payment methods are as referenced in paragraph 3. So this is a checkbox system. We all love checkboxes, right? So make sure that you check the correct box or boxes that match your policies. Make sure that the addresses that you list here are complete and correct. Remember that you can check more than one box. You might be willing to accept payments both by mail to a lockbox account and a portal. So it's okay to check more than one box. It's also okay, as Sandy explained, because this is a sample management form, if you don't like checkboxes, you can get rid of them. You can, instead of having checkboxes, modify the document and only list the permitted places and methods for payment. Your choice. Next slide. This is the security deposit paragraph from Lease 2.0. And we're highlighting here, again, in accordance with our community policies, we can make deductions from your deposit. Remember in the Lease 1.0, I guess we're calling it now, there was a sample list of deductions, and that's been removed. And now that sample list of deductions and other specifics about the security deposit are in the community policies. Let me draw your attention to the last sentence in this 5.1. Any refund may be by one payment jointly payable to all residents and distributed to any one resident we choose, or distributed equally among all residents. That used to be a checkbox. We're trying to get away from checkboxes, and this is just giving you, the owner, the discretion on how you want to make the deposit refund. We go to the next slide. We see the matching security deposit language in the community addendum. So here is that language that you're used to seeing that has the list of sample deductions. It's not an exhaustive list, but it's examples of the most common ones. And then it also has that same language, see that last sentence, any refund may be by one payment jointly payable to all residents and distributed to any one resident we choose, or distributed equally among all residents. And you as the owner get to decide. Next slide, please. So here, for the first time, we've combined the lease and the community policies language side by side. So at the top, you see what's in parking, the parking paragraph in the lease, it's paragraph 13. And it's shorter. It doesn't have that long list of specific prohibitions and restrictions that used to be in the lease. So this is another example of it's a best practice to supplement the lease with your community policies and tailor them to your specific community. You may want to add even further restrictions. And if we look at the bottom of the slide, we see paragraph 5 from the community policies addendum, and it has a list of prohibitions and restrictions. You might have additional ones that apply to your property. Are you a mixed use property that shares parking with retail? You might want to address that here. Do you require a permit or a sticker or a placard of some kind to designate a resident and you have resident only parking? That would be something to address in your community policies. And just a little reminder, we'll talk about this more at Red Book, but if you look at the bottom of the slide, paragraph 5, the sample from the community policies addendum has a list of restrictions. Restriction L, when you are towing for current license or registration, you have to give at least 10 days notice. And you have to have the resident, the owner of the vehicle, sign this document, which they are signing the community policies addendum, and it is part of the lease, but that is worded that way to comply with a particular provision of state law that requires the 10-day written notice in that instance of towing for expired license or registration, which actually now, they go together. And so next slide. Request and notices. So in 15.1, the highlighted language, there are exceptions to the requirement of written notice that are spelled out here. Typically, all notices have to be in writing, but if it's an emergency, an immediate risk of injury to a person or serious property damage, they can give you a phone call and tell you about that. Fair housing requests for accommodation and modification do not have to be in writing. You, of course, may have your own form that you take that request and make a record of it, but there are a couple of exceptions here to written notice. 15.2 reminds the resident that they have to notify you promptly of leaks, mold, or other hazardous conditions that might require an immediate response, and that time can make the problem worse and cause additional damage. And then also pointing out to you, and these are where the lease discusses notice. We just looked at paragraph 15. Now we're going to look at paragraph 21. And if you look there in the highlighted language, 21.1, it talks about how sometimes notices can be electronic. They can be via email. And again, you get to specify what email address or the specifics in your community policies. Just a reminder, see in that first sentence, it says notice may be given electronically by us, the owner, to you if allowed by law. So remember that if allowed by law. I don't want anyone to leave our discussion today thinking, hey, I can give a notice to vacate by email now. No, you can't. Those provisions of the Texas Property Code still apply, and we still have to comply with them. Next slide. So here is language from the community policies addendum regarding notice. So again, like we saw in the payments paragraph, there are check boxes. So we want to make sure that we're checking the correct box or boxes. And remember that if the box is not checked, it's not permitted. So if you're concerned about checking the correct boxes, again, you can always modify that and just make it a list of the ones you allow and remove the others. Make sure that email address is complete, correct, and monitored. If it's not a specific person's, if it's maintenance at Happy Trails, just make sure that that one is monitored if you're directing people to that one. This paragraph 6, HVAC operation, I love this. This is a great improvement and change. Something that I have seen very frequently is we get a lot of complaints from residents about mildew from condensation in their HVA system and in the ductwork. And it is not unusual for those situations to be caused by leaving the HVAC system in the on setting rather than the auto setting, going on vacation for 3 or 4 weeks and turning it off completely, or setting it at unreasonably low temperatures like 65 when it's 100 degrees outside. Now this addresses some of those things about keeping it on, even if you're gone for multiple days, having it set at auto and making sure that you're running the heat when it's really cold. It doesn't specify 72 degrees, but that's something that you could make a recommendation about if you wanted to modify this form. But overall, I think this is going to be a very helpful tool. I think these are best practices that we had told residents about in the past, but we didn't have them specified anywhere. And I think that's the end of my time. I'm going to toss it over to David.
Thank you, Jennifer. Great job. I appreciate being asked by TAA to speak to all of you today, and I want to commend everybody for being here. This is an important set of changes to your practice. And guys, you cannot get enough education, whether you're attending TAA webinars, whether you're attending education seminars at your local, at the TAA education conference or the NAA education conference. You cannot get enough education because you're in a very dynamic industry. And some of you heard me say this before, but I don't think that there is any other industry or profession in the country that gives as much opportunity for advancement as the multifamily housing industry. There's no other, and let me just give you a quick example. A person who started moonlighting, cleaning apartments at night, rose through the ranks to be president of their local, president of TAA, and chairman of NAA. There's just so much opportunity, and part of your job as a professional in this industry is to attend education conferences, because guys, you've seen over the last 2 years, it's gotten much tougher to practice your profession. So having said that, I'm going to jump in, and one of the first things I want to remind you guys of, back over in slide 10, that Sandy talked about, right above the signature lines, there's something called an integration clause. There's a sentence that specifically says, this lease is the entire agreement between you and us. That is a very important provision, because whether you use, and you should use, these community policies, or you have your own, or you have some blend of both, remember they become part of the lease. And that one sentence makes it very clear that this is the entire agreement between the tenant and you. The second sentence right below that says you're not relying on any oral representations. In other words, at the end of the day, when your resident signs the lease, everyone is bound by the four corners of that lease. So let me jump into slide 19 here, the amenities section. First thing I want to mention is you really need to talk to council if you're still charging an amenity fee. Amenity fees are inherently dangerous. I'm not certain that they are completely legal, and you really need to be concerned about whether there is some disguised amenity fee or however you charge it. There are ways to take care of that issue, but I recommend that you talk to your council about that. Specifically, if you look in line number 2 of paragraph 7 on amenities, the word license appears. This is the first time I believe that the word license has appeared in any TA form, and that's very important for you to understand. The person who is using an amenity is using it because of a license. A license is a right to use real property or to use an amenity, and it's like having a ticket to a sporting event or a concert. If you look on the back of the ticket says, we can kick you out of this event if you don't comply with our rules. That is part of the reason that now the community policies addendum says that amenities are used solely under a license that allows you to remove folks and to control what occurs in your various amenities. And remember, it kind of dovetails also with paragraph 10.3 of the lease, where you have the absolute right to govern the activities of guests of residents. The next part of that sentence in line 2, this permission is expressly conditioned upon your compliance with the terms of the lease. That is basically saying you have no choice but to follow our community policies regarding use of the amenities. The bold section at the bottom of paragraph 7 also talks about releasing past, current, or future claims of liability for the use of the amenities. I want you to be very careful with that, because this is the third part of this sentence is somewhat of a deterrent, because current and past acts can be released, but future claims, there's some, there's some discussion in the law whether future claims can actually be released in a document. But the point is, if there are any claims that are made because somebody fell down using a playground piece of equipment, this section may assist you in releasing you from liability for that. Next slide, please. Oh, one last thing. Remember, you can't ever release future negligence. All right, package services. Notice that there is a checkbox here in paragraph 8. Make certain that you do fill out the checkbox on whether you do or do not accept packages on behalf of residents. This section basically says that when you do accept packages, when it's checked that you do accept packages, it sets up what your duties are and gives you the right to sign and accept parcels or letters from any delivery service. Now, one thing that in preparing for this webinar, we talked about a little bit at length is some of the package services are now being outsourced to third-party vendors. Be very careful when you do outsource. It's very important that you carefully review and understand what your duties are and what the third-party vendor's duties are under your package delivery acceptance service. So be very, very careful with that, because not one size fits all with regard to package services. So do be careful with that. Next slide, please. This came out of the lease. This basically just tells your resident that the lease that they are signing is subordinate to your current lender and future lenders' mortgages. And all that means is if for some reason a lender forecloses on the property, technically the lease is subordinate to that foreclosure, and it could wipe out that lease, and it's really subject to what the lender chooses to do, which is at the end of the sentence. Next slide, please, on special provisions. Now, remember there is paragraph 32, the special provisions in the TAA lease, and you also have this paragraph 10 special provisions section in the community policies addendum. You don't have to use this. You can. It is your election, but more information can be added here with regard to specific provisions controlling over the conflicting provisions of the community addendum form, policies addendum form. When you put anything in this paragraph 10, you need to be very careful, because the first sentence here says anything that you write into this special provisions section controls over the other 1 through 9 sections of the special provisions. Some people use the special provisions paragraph of the lease, or perhaps here for their own community policies. That's totally acceptable, and they become part of the lease because of the integration clause that we talked about earlier, that the lease is the entire the entire agreement between the parties. Next slide. So on the next slide, we're talking about access. The interesting thing about the first sentence here, guys, and I've done 2 of these in my career. You're leasing the apartment. The resident is leasing the apartment for use as a private residence only. Now, you'll recall that there's some exceptions to that if there's no traffic or anything like that. But the private residence only language is enforceable, and you can give a notice to vacate for non-rent breach, for non-delinquency breach of lease, if someone is starting to use their business or their apartment for a business that causes traffic and other interruptions and disturbances of the community. So don't forget about that section. It is now in section 2 in the preamble to the subparagraphs of 2. 2.1 basically gives you the place where you list what access and other devices you are delivering to the resident at the front end of the lease. That can also be a basis when you get to the end of the lease for you to determine whether surrender has actually occurred. Have they turned in all keys and access devices to you? Now, we know that we are getting into new areas of the law here because of ring devices and other devices that may be installed at a unit, whether it's part of the original construction or after construction at the election of the resident. Don't forget that TAA has a lease addendum for access control devices that you guys can utilize. Next slide, please. Paragraph 6 has taken part of what was in the lease out of the, well, I strike that. You may have community policies that you include in the community policies addendum that address insurance, but one major change is that you will be required as the resident to have liability insurance as required in either the community policies that you guys publish or the TAA community policies addendum. The second big change here is in about the 6th line about requiring your insurance carrier to waive subrogation. The TAA lease used to say that the tenant waives the subrogation rights, and the only person who can, under an insurance policy, waive subrogation is the carrier. That's a hyper technical set of words that deal with whether or not the carrier can step into your shoes to make a claim after they pay a claim. So if you have questions about this section of the lease, make sure you talk to your counsel or to your risk management department, and they can, I'm sure, help you there as well. Don't forget, there is also TA's insurance addendum that you can utilize with regard to embellishing the provisions of the lease regarding insurance or any provisions that you include in the community policies addendum. And then finally, next slide. 2 things I really want to point out about this. In the second paragraph of paragraph 11 of the lease, it talks about using customary diligence in maintaining the apartment, keeping it in a sanitary condition and not damaging or littering the common areas. Remember that when you have a hoarding situation, paragraph 11 is one of the paragraphs on which you can rely with regard to the condition of the unit, because that resident has a duty to maintain the condition of that unit. That is your asset, and it cannot damage or in any way affect other units surrounding in the building, or, with regard to pests or vermin that are attracted. So don't forget, hoarding could be an issue that you can use the second paragraph of paragraph 11 under prohibited conduct. Now, One last thing about hoarding, don't forget that there could be a fair housing implication because a person who is hoarding may have a form of ACD. Finally, one of the big issues that we're facing is in 11.1 with smoking. What is smoking? What constitutes smoking? What devices are really smoking devices? All types of tobacco, all types of cannabis, drugs can be smoked. Remember that we now have 11.1K, smoking of any kind that is not in accordance with our community policies or lease addenda is prohibited and serves as a basis for a notice to vacate if a resident or occupant or guest is violating that section. Don't forget, over at the right, there is a TAA no smoking lease addendum that you can utilize to address this issue in more detail. I think this is something we'll be seeing a lot more of in education and articles going forward. At this point, I'll kick it back to Sandy. Thank you guys again for attending, and we look forward to answering some of your questions here.
Thank you, David. Thanks, Jennifer. We have a couple questions, a couple themes running through. The first one, a point of clarification. We haven't really substantively changed the related addenda. So there are no major changes coming in the utility addenda or any other lease addenda. What we have done, or we are changing the paragraph references in those lease addenda to match the new lease 2.0. So if you are looking for what the addenda will look like, it's going to look very similar to what it does now, save for those paragraph references. So just if you have any questions about that, of course, and you want to, a specific addenda, you have a question on a provision, don't hesitate to reach out. We have several questions, Jennifer, on the towing question about whether or not you need to have any additional language outside of the community policies addendum to tow for the after the 10-day expired registration issue. So I'm going to find that lease, but can you elaborate a little bit on that point?
So the language here in paragraph 5 of the community policies addendum does meet the requirement of having a contractual agreement from the resident, the owner of the vehicle, that you can tow for the expired license and registration. There's not additional language that you need to add, but just remember that you do have to then give that 10-day written notice at the time it occurs before you tow the vehicle. So I hope that makes sense. Contractual agreement is satisfied here with this language. You don't need additional language, but when that event occurs and you are ready to tow a car for expired license or registration, you have to give that 10-day notice.
Right. That was one of the biggest questions. Corey or Glenda, are there any other things from the chat function, that issues that we might be helpful to bring up to and discuss verbally? I know I'm putting you all on the spot, but is there anything that we should cover again?
Just a couple of consistent themes, Sandy. I would say one thing, and you emphasize this at the top, I think it's worth, I think we talked about it all, I think all of you talked about it, but just to reemphasize, the community policies, think of that as a living document. We want you to take that and make it your own. You should customize it and edit it. So if there's an issue about, well, I don't know if I check yes or no, if I take packages, change it, delete yes or no, and just write out your policy and explain it in the community policies. This is an editable document. You're going to want to make it and customize it to your specific needs and circumstances. I would also say the other big theme was people asking about their own community policies or existing community rules and community policies. And my general thought on that is you want to combine those two. You can either take the content of TAA's community policies and put it into your own community policies, or take your own and combine it into the TAA community policies. But just for simplicity and ease of use, I would encourage you to combine the two documents.
Yeah, and I mean, part of the review is, am I covered in using the TAA addenda, let's say on no smoking? Do I feel like that says everything I need to say on smoking? Do I need all of those provisions on smoking? Let's say you look at the no smoking addendum and only 2 paragraphs really relate to your operations and your rules. Then stick those 2 paragraphs into the community policies addendum. That is the perfect way of cutting out that piece of paper and incorporating it into the community policies addendum, putting everything right there that is on that topic. And so it kind of is getting towards this master addendum idea. And that is where, part of our rewrite is we're taking the 50-page lease that often it can be, and trying to reduce it down to absolutely the things that are absolutely necessary and good to have for your lease packet. Now, Jennifer, you raised your hand, but you can just you're on mute though.
Sorry, I saw, looking at the chat, a couple of people asking about Ring doorbells or video doorbells. Does the lease prohibit residents from installing those on the door? I don't think that's a change in 2.0. I would refer folks to 20.2 of the lease 2.0, which says you can't make any alterations without our written consent. And so I think if we were talking about the front of the door itself or the door frame around the door, that is something that we control. That would be an alteration. So again, this is our theme of opportunity and growth. So you can think about, do you want to have a policy about whether you allow them or not? Do you want to regulate them if you allow them? And you would address that in your community policies.
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm looking at a couple other questions. It seems like a lot of the questions do relate to some of the provisions that were kind of outside the scope of this presentation. This one is really about the community policies addendum and those lease references in the lease document of community policies. We have those other 2 webinars, the short 1-hour webinars that do focus on other lease provisions. And if you do have a specific question, again, don't hesitate to reach out. We have some questions about flood disclosure notices, and we have some recent articles on the flood disclosure notice that was released January 1 in our system is now is batch printed with every lease. If you have any questions, please refer to that article on that and contact us if there's any further questions. With that, I think we have covered what we need to cover. Again, we really appreciate your attendance here. We had quite a bit of participation and a lot of activity in the chat function. Thank you, Corey, for addressing a lot of that. And David and Jennifer, as always, appreciate your counsel and guidance. And I hope you all have a wonderful day and stay tuned for further updates and educational opportunities as the rollout approaches us. Thank you.
Good to be here.